1949, a year before the Korean War and 4 years after the end of World War II, one of the biggest blows to American Cold War foreign policy happens, and that is the victory of the Chinese Communist Party over what was known as the Nationalist Party, or the Kuomintang in China. One of the most populous, if not the most populous, country on the planet becomes a haven for communism. So now, if you look at the map of Asia, most of it is red for communist. So how do we get here? What happens leading up to the communist victory in 1949? So we'll go back to the beginning of the 20th century. So in 1908, the last emperor of China comes to the throne. And here he is. This is Puyi. No, not him. This is Puyi, who is emperor of China from 1908 to 1911. And he is the last Qing emperor. So this is the final dynasty of China. So for 2,000 years, China had been ruled by dynasties. They had been an empire ruled by an emperor. That comes crashing down in 1911. They collapse because of foreign influence, right? Remember, we talked about the Opium Wars, we talked about the Taiping Rebellion, we talked about the Boxer Rebellion. All of those things are unsettling China. They're destabilizing it. And there had been a series of natural disasters as well that the Qing dynasty and the rulers that the Qing rulers as well had been incapable of dealing with. And they had also faced internal opposition. So there were factions within China that were starting to essentially boycott and protest the dynasty. So in 1911, all of that comes to a halt, and what is established in China is what's called the Republic. Lots of people would say that the Republic lasts from 1911-ish to 1949. So it's founded by not this guy, but another guy. His name is Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen is a pretty awesome dude. He was a medical doctor. He was a philosopher. He traveled in France and in the United States and in England. And he is essentially the founder of the Chinese Republic, but he doesn't feel capable ruling, and so he steps down and he puts this general in power. His name is Yuan Shikai. And Yuan Shikai basically makes a mess of China during the First World War, and then he dies. And then there's this period of destabilization within the Republic, and the person who emerges to, for crying out loud, to lead the Nationalist Party is this guy. His name is Chiang Kai shek. The Nationalist Party, its like Chinese name is the Kuomintang. Because it is in Chinese, it can be pronounced, it would be pronounced differently, but basically it is abbreviated KMT for Kuomintang, because we kind of approximate those sounds. So if I write KMT, this is what I'm referring to. And they kind of, right, they are leading China, but they are very corrupt. They get a lot of support from the United States, a lot of support from Great Britain, and they really don't do well. They're corrupt. The peasants are still impoverished. And their only support really comes from urban elites and foreigners like Americans. Like, we are pumping tons of money to Chiang Kai-shek in order to kind of bolster his government, and he just kind of doesn't do anything right. So in 1921, the Communist Party forms in China, right? And it goes by CCP for Chinese Communist Party. So if I write CCP, that's what I'm talking about. And communism doesn't really work. It's not easily adaptable into China because they have a really tiny urban working class, and that's kind of who are supposed to be the proletariats, right? So it doesn't grow as fast as one would think. However, in 1927, the CCP is banned by our friend Chiang Kai-shek, and any communists are kind of kicked out of cities and they have to flee to the countryside. This wasn't happening yesterday. That's kind of a really giant mistake on Chiang Kai-shek's part, because when they flee to the countryside, they are able to start just like Castro when after he lands to fight Batista's regime. They're able to start building up a big base of support amongst the Chinese peasants. Um, and it's during that time that a young man named Mao Zedong becomes their charismatic leader. And we see him here. This painting is actually from later. This painting is from 1967 during something we'll talk about called the Cultural Revolution. But look at our young and valiant Mao. He's striding through the tops of mountains. Wow, super impressive. And where he's going, he is going towards a place called Yuan. And there are these coal miners and these railway workers who want to go on strike, but they don't have the courage to do so. And so our brave young communist Mao, he is going to go lead them, 13,000 of them, in fact, in this nonviolent strike demanding better workers' rights. Um, so you're right, this is super propaganda. The painter who paints it, Lin Chu Han, he is like a propagandist. It's what he does. So this is definitely like pro Mao propaganda, but it shows how the CCP sees Mao kind of this hero worship, right? Like look at this painting, um, right? In terms of how he is put up on this pedestal and this kind of cult develops around him. And luckily for them, most of these 13,000 miners and railway workers will actually end up joining the CCP's army. And the CCP's army is called, just like during the Russian Civil War, they're called the Red Army, right? We always associate the color red with communists. So this is kind of from 1927 onward is kind of the period that we refer to as the Chinese Civil War. And it's a civil war because the CCP, the Communist Party, is fighting Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang or the KMT. And the KMT has all of the money and resources, especially from the United States and other Western powers. And so they are always on the verge of defeating the communists. Kind of like they're just always a hair's breadth away from defeating the communists. In fact, they almost do in 1934, except kind of through the savviness of Mao, they're able to escape through this event called the Long March. And this is again a propaganda painting that illustrates the Long March. The Long March goes from, oh my gosh, goes from 1934 into 1935, and basically it's this daring escape that lasts like 6 months, in which the Communist Party has to go through bogs and swamps and through mountains. Like they're called the Snowy Mountains. It's almost like a scene from The Lord of the Rings when the Fellowship of the Ring has to go through the Misty Mountains and they all almost die and then they go into the mines of Moria, and like it's this harrowing escape. And that's essentially what the Long March is. And so the communists are able to escape. They live to fight another day. And then, starting in 1937, we get Japan's invasion, right? And Japan's invasion really allows for the communists to shine. Um, Chiang Kai-shek, I'll say that again, and his KMT, it looks to the Chinese people as though the KMT and Chiang Kai-shek are much more concerned about fighting Mao and the communists than they are about protecting the Chinese from the Japanese soldiers, right? And you guys heard about the Nanking massacre that I talked about. So think about that. That has happened. Chiang Kai-shek's troops have fled. They have escaped, right? The ones who could escaped and left the people of the capital of Nanjing to the mercy of the Japanese. Like, how are you going to trust your government if it can't protect you? So instead, the guerrilla warfare that the communists had been using against the nationalists and the KMT and Chiang Kai-shek, they start using that against the Japanese. So they start going to kind of towns and villages on the front lines and fighting the Japanese and helping the peasants to prepare for Japanese uh, attacks and like move them and their stuff kind of away from the front lines. So, and you can kind of see right in this map, this red, these are the communist strongholds. They are kind of this front line between the invading Japanese and China. And so this makes them really popular with the peasants, who are the grand majority of China's population. And as they are getting this practice, both fighting the Japanese, but also establishing governments in the places that they are liberating from the Japanese, they start to deal with, or at least show that they can deal with China's big issues. And China's big issues are foreign influence, right? In this way, it's Japanese invasion, but it was the influence of the British or the Americans or what have you. And also the poor conditions of the peasants. And that kind of builds their reputation to where they're seen as very honest and they're seen as very helpful. Whereas Chiang Kai shek and his troops and the nationalists, they're seen as corrupt and they're seen as abandoning the Chinese people uh, to everyone, right, in order to defeat Mao. So that's what kind of puts the communists in the position to, in 1949, defeat Chiang Kai shek. Chiang Kai shek and his nationalist troops flee to Taiwan in 1949, and Taiwan becomes its own version of China, which it still claims to be today. China, the People's Republic of China, the communist one, they claim Taiwan as part of them, but Taiwan's like, no, we're cool, right? So that's kind of how that situation arose.